My name is Rachael Chisholm, and with me now in the studio is Northern Territory Minister of Education and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, the Honourable Selena Uibo. Thank you, Minister, for coming into the studio.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having me, and to your listeners and your viewers.
Now, of course, the state of the world at the moment, the big topic, of course, is Covid19, also known as the coronavirus. You are looking after a big population of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. Can you please just talk to our viewers and our listeners about what the Northern Territory government is doing to make sure our most vulnerable and our remote Aboriginal communities are being taken care of?
Yes, it is a big concern. We know that coronavirus is a threat not just here in the Northern Territory, right across Australia, and of course we've seen international devastation and people being sick or people dying from this particular virus. So we are taking measures very seriously in terms of the protection of Territorians, but also have the big concern of the protection of our remote Territorians, many who are Aboriginal brothers and sisters, and what are the measures we can put in place as a Territory government, working alongside and in partnership with the federal, national government and the other states. We have a large geographic area to cover. A third of our population in the Territory is Aboriginal. What can we do to mitigate the risks, to stop the risks of spread of coronavirus in the Territory, but particularly to our remote Aboriginal Territorians in our communities, on our homelands and in our outstations. So very happy to talk about some of those measures, but also answer any questions that you or your viewers or listeners may have been talking about over the last few weeks.
As we're coming up to the school holidays, let's talk about our schools. Are they closed? Are they open? And what is happening in term 2?
Really good question, Rachel. So we saw different jurisdictions, different states make different decisions over the last week in terms of being able to protect the community. The AHPPC, they're the peak medical experts who are providing advice to the Prime Minister, to the National Cabinet, which has all of the premiers from each state, as well as our two chief ministers, NT and ACT. That advice from the AHPPC remains the same, which is schools are safe to attend, schools are safe for our education workers, so our teachers, our principals and our ATs and our volunteers who come into the school community to assist our children. So that advice is clear, it's safe for schools, and particularly here in the Territory we have not received any community transmissions of the coronavirus. In terms of being able to alleviate some of the stress and anxiety that our schools are experiencing and that our families are experiencing, our government made the announcement to move to a professional development days for week 11 of our school term. So schools are still open. They are operating, not quite in the same capacity as what we would normally see in during this time of the term, but there are adjustments now that we've made. So the last week of school, week 11, which is from the 6th to the 9th of April, our schools will have professional development days available for our teachers and our principals, so they can start planning about what term 2 looks like. We only have the 1 week school break. All the other states have 2 weeks. But what will school look like in terms of the delivery of classes, education, material support for our Territory kids in term 2? So again, it's very difficult to predict. We have changing advice and changing circumstances across the country, if not on a daily basis, every couple of days. So in terms of being able to alleviate the stress on our schools, we've made that announcement as government so our teachers can plan. We've asked that families who can keep their kids at home do so in that week 11 to allow our teachers and our principals to be able to plan for the alternative delivery of education. If they cannot leave their kids at home or cannot cater for their kids at home, schools will be available during that period, that week 11 period from the 6th to the 9th of April for those children, for those essential workers.
Yeah. Good to know and good to hear. But in regards to term 2, there is a possibility that it might be online courses, for example, like FaceTime in a group situation. A question that I have seen being raised on social media is parents are wondering, does that mean a parent has to stay home if it's a 2-income household?
In terms of the delivery of education, again, where the Department of Education here in the NT is already looking at ways to support our schools. Some schools will be able to move to an online delivery. They have the technology, they might have the skills and expertise to be able to deliver that for their student cohort. Other schools may not. There's also the challenge of schools that or families who may not have access to technology, internet, broadband, etc. Yeah. In those cases, the department's already started printing hard copy materials to allow schools to be able to deliver printed materials or online delivery, and working in what capacity schools have to be able to deliver education, making sure they're not on their own, that they are absolutely supported by the Department of Education here in the Territory. We've also been sharing different resources and online platforms with other jurisdictions, South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland, in terms of where we sit physically in Australia. So we've really seen some good work and collaborations outside of the Territory so that we can all share ideas. We have the NT Distance School of Education, who operates as a distance and interactive learning model anyway. We also have the Catherine School of Air and the Alice Springs School of Air, who have been operating for many, many years, decades, in that space of delivery. So we're drawing upon their expertise, their staff and expertise to be able to support teachers all across the Territory to look at different ways of how would you be able to teach a class if your class is not physically there, or everyone is not necessarily attending school in person. How can we still continue on to deliver education in the Territory?
And there will be support from to parents if one has to stay back.
So parents, I know some parents and families have already opted to take their children out of school. As of Tuesday this week, schooling has not been compulsory. The Chief Minister, based on National Cabinet advice, has said that as of Term 2, schooling will be compulsory again, whether that's at home or being able to be delivered in school physically or another venue or location possibly. So there are already homeschooling models, and there's already material that's available, and I believe we've got links already on the Northern Territory Department of Education website that if families are keeping their kids home, and then that's really important to stress, Rachel, that they're at home and not elsewhere. That if kids are at home, that their families are looking to do homework packs, etc., that they've got that support, whether it's online or if it's through printed materials.
All right. Well, we've covered kids who, have the option to go to school or stay home and what may be happening in Term 2. Can you talk about our kids who are boarders? What's their situation at the moment?
So our boarding school students in the Territory, we have quite a large number, Rachel. We have close to 2,000. It's actually about 1,900 Territory students who board either here in the Territory or interstate. Schools had identified that it was a stress point, and it was very anxious for families and for students and even staff to have kids out of their own communities or towns. So movement started happening, as early as 3 weeks ago, of returning students to their homes, whether it is from interstate or across the Territory. So that's very close to being completed now. There's only about 140 students now that are out of the Territory that are interstate, and then if they are to return to the Territory, they obviously have to adhere to the isolation restrictions that everyone else coming across the Territory border has to adhere to, and do a 14-day isolation either at home or before they return to their community, depending on what the arrangements are. We have support with our Education Transition Support Unit, who have been working with the return of students, and particularly making sure that kids are supported as they go back to their home communities.
Thank you for that, to know that our kids in boarding school have those options. Another question in regards to remote communities is, who can go in and out, and can people in remote communities leave, or is it complete and utter shutdown?
On the evening of the 26th of March, Thursday evening at midnight, the National Cabinet endorsed the enactment of the Biosecurity Act, which is a Commonwealth law. 2015 is when the legislation was last put through, and that is enacted across Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia. So it came into effect at midnight of the 26th of March. So we're working out some of the details in terms of the impact of movement and restriction to particularly Aboriginal communities, what that looks like. The Department of the Chief Minister here in the Territory, the 4 land councils in the Northern Territory, our peak health organisation AMSANT, as well as some of our Aboriginal controlled health organisations have been part of a working group, a remote task force, which has been a working group in considering what measures of protection we can in place for Territorians in our remote areas, our Aboriginal Territorians, what impact that is in terms of cutting off communities. The Northern Territory government announced last week that we would ban non-essential travel into our remote communities, so people travelling through or just going through for consultation as opposed to delivering a service. So our nurses, our doctors, our police, our teachers are considered as essential, but also, Rachel, our couriers for our food supply. Our shops need to have food for our mob, so that is essential service. Also, the delivery of power and water essential services, technicians working on telecommunications. So there's been a range of work identifying what does essential actually mean. Can the community still operate without that worker going in or out? People who are in the community, such as construction teams, are fine to continue on their working because they're already in the community, but any new building teams, for example, have been banned because of wanting to control the movement of people and make sure that we don't spread coronavirus by accident into a remote community. So there's some of the measures that have been taken in place. What it means in terms of travel restrictions to remote communities as of today, there's lots of questions. There's a lot of movement. People who may live in a remote community close to a town centre. So, for example, I live in Katherine. Barunga's only 45 minutes away. Can Barunga community residents travel into Katherine for shopping or medical, etc., and then return to their community? That's the sort of work of detail we need to make sure we get through with our remote task force, with the land councils, with the Department of the Chief Minister and our health organisations to say, what's the risk of then going back to your community, and will you need to self-isolate for 14 days before you can return to your community? So a lot of questions around that currently.
And that's going to be worked on in the next couple of weeks.
Next couple of days. I'd say. And particularly with the access to information, we need to make sure that's clear. We need to make sure that information's going out in first language. We have a lot of mob where English is not their first language. We need to make sure that that communication and the messaging is clear, but it's understood in first language as well.
Kuna information wongai berpegaliarikya Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal Northern Territory government. Kunguna kangatanela sickness, kunguna kanalanga coronavirus. Kaneranga kapanangarakia Covid19. Kunguna kalaninga.
And then also, what does it mean to if you've gone out of your community and you return from if you're wanting to return from a urban centre? Where do you self-isolate if your home is in your community? Where do you spend that 14 days?
So there's, as we all know, in Darwin here, we've got the Howard Springs facility. But over the next couple of days, will the government be looking at Katherine, Tennant Creek and Alice Springs for
Yes, definitely, and including Nhulunbuy as well.
Yep.
And then there's also lots of questions around some of our towns that are under mining leases.
Yeah.
So Jabiru, which is in my electorate of Arnhem, Nhulunbuy in northeast Arnhem, and Borroloola as well. So we'll have lots of questions around the travel in and out of those townships to either neighbouring communities or homelands or outstations.
While we're talking about access in and out of our remote communities, how about the Northern Territory as a whole? When I first heard the restrictions were in place, I was under the assumption that the Northern Territory was in complete lockdown, but that's not the case. Could you please clarify what what's happening with our NT borders?
That's been a very confusing one because the language around it has been banned, whereas the Chief Minister's trying to be very clear in saying their border restrictions and controls on the travel. Under the Australian Constitution, you're not allowed to you're not allowed to restrict the movement of people across the borders. And I think I don't know the exact lines, Rachel, but around the economic movement and of goods and services and trading, which is why you're hearing the stories that people are getting to the border, being allowed into the territory. They do have to fill in forms. There's police and the Australian Defence Force at all of the border entries around the territory. And it's making sure that we know who's coming in, where are they going to, and the requirement is you have to have a place of self-isolation for 14 days. You have to have an address that you're going to, and then if there are spot checks that are needed, that either the police or the Defence Force can follow up of where you physically are, and making sure that people are doing the right thing by self-isolating. If they don't provide that information, then they will not be coming across the border. They have to have those stat decks all in place.
For an example, or walk me through it, someone's just crossed the border from South Australia into the Northern Territory. They come to the stop, they fill out those forms. Do they put in those forms the truck stops they stay at as well?
My understanding, Rachel, is that anywhere that they're intending to stop, whether it's road service stations, whether it's stopping to get provisions and supplies, that information all has to be completed.
Okay, so the government can track these people when they come in. Right. So there's no testing of people coming interstate?
Not at this point, is my understanding. A National Cabinet met on Wednesday, the 25th of March, and expanded the criteria of testing. So the criteria was anyone who's been overseas or suspected to be in contact with someone who may have coronavirus and it's been overseas were the criteria for testing. That's now expanded to allow for more testing of people. They've made that more flexible. So it was very strict before. If you hadn't been overseas or been in contact with someone overseas, you couldn't get tested. Now our health workers who may be exposed to the possibility of people with coronavirus, they're now able to be tested, possibly, more professions who may be at the front line, like our Defence Force, like our police, etc. So that decision was only made on Wednesday evening, the 25th of March. So we're hoping that could expand to the availability of testing at the border.
Another big question that's coming from the Northern Territory public is food supplies. As you know, the Northern Territory is vast and very remote, and people are, hoarding and panic buying. How can the government let the Northern Territory population know that food will always be flowing in?
It's a really great point, Rachel, because we have seen, as you've said, panic buying right across Australia, and we have seen it here in the Territory. It's quite it sparks more fear, more anxiety in people when they think, oh, well, what am I not stacking up for? I'll need to go out and do that. I think it's great people want to be prepared for if they have to self-isolate, but in terms of supply and demand, there is enough. We've heard from the big companies like Woolworths and Coles and their national directors that there is enough food, there is enough supplies in Australia, but people just need to do their normal, regular shopping.
Yep.
The Chief Minister said maybe top up on a bit more of the canned supply rather than the fresh because it lasts longer, but don't need to go in and buy hordes and hordes of food and store it, freeze it, etc. And mostly to the point that it will disadvantage some of our vulnerable citizens, people who rely on sort of daily or weekly shopping. Will not be able to access the supplies that they need. So in terms of their health, it could affect their health, but also their mental health in terms of the anxiety of not having enough food for that day or that week. So there is enough food around Australia to be able to supply everyone the way it's been working for the last couple of years. Be sensible with your food supply, but particularly around our remote communities. If there's an impact on not being able to supply the food and the essential items we need, we're talking babies, nappies, hand soap and wash, things that people need to stay healthy and clean, as well as be fed, then it's going to affect some people who are in our remote areas. We have the support of the federal government with Minister Ken White, who's committed that if there are any issues in terms of the delivery of food services and essential items in our communities, that we'll have the support of the Australian Defence Force to logistically be able to get food supplies out to our remote areas. So we have that commitment from the federal government.
Okay, so for those who are listening or watching in remote communities, help will be on the way if it gets to a drastic point. I just have one more question for you. In the event of a full nationwide lockdown, what does that mean in regards to quarantine, isolation, and getting out and shopping?
From Sunday night, we saw some dramatic decisions that have impacted our businesses, impacted our social lives as we know it. It's about the adjustment and flexibility. If there was to be nationwide lockdown, then we would need to adjust to that as well. What does it mean in the Territory? I think the big ones, like you've asked already, food security, also water security, essential services and telecommunications, and how we can adjust to making sure those things are still running, but also medication, making sure that our old people and our chronically ill people and our young kids with chronic health issues are still supplied with what they need medically to be able to keep their health strong. I guess the more we prepare now, and the Territory's in a good position we're not at the level of cases that some other states and territories have been experiencing, but if the more prepared the Northern Territory is to support Territorians and anyone who is staying here, either for work purposes or because they are not able to, or they're choosing not to return to their home states for safety, is making sure that we have lots of plans in place. But again, the messages are clear, that we don't have the panic buying, that we are looking after each other, that we are patient and understanding when people don't know the answers to questions. Ultimately, what we want to see is that Territorians' lives are safe, and then our jobs are safe as well for those people who are still able to work, that can continue, but we're all supporting each other in the broader context, because once we stop thinking about each other, then I think we'll run into problems. Checking in on the oldies, making sure your family is okay, even if it's talking about how worried people are. We need to make sure we support the mental health and well-being of Territorians as much as the physical safety. So I guess, Rachel, just making sure people stay aware. We've talked about how the advice can change from day to day. So if you've read something yesterday, it might be different again today. So I encourage Territorians, particularly those who can access internet, Secure NT website will have the most up-to-date information on any decisions that National Cabinet makes and where to get the information here in the Territory. So making sure you're staying up to date and making sure you're checking in on each other, that people understand the social distancing and the hygiene rules, making sure we're washing hands more regularly, that we're 1.5 meters apart from people. When we hear those rules, they might sound silly or they might be frustrating in terms of not being able to sit in your favourite cafe or, go up and hug your friend. Yeah. But if we're wanting to keep each other safe, then that's what we need to do. We need to listen to the health advice.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Uibo, for coming into the studio and talking with us, talking to me and all the listeners and watchers today.
Thank you, Rachel.